Detective Henry Marsh sat at his desk, the late afternoon sunlight casting a golden glow across the cluttered office. The scent of stale coffee and old paper filled the air, a familiar comfort in a world full of chaos. He leaned back into his creaky chair, rubbing his temples. It had been another long day filled with dead ends and unanswered questions. Just as he reached for his cold coffee, a knock echoed on his office door. He frowned. It was odd. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find nothing but an empty hallway. He stepped out, glancing left and right, but the corridor was deserted. With a shrug, he turned back to his desk and noticed it. A single envelope lying on top of the case files. His name was written neatly on the front in cursive handwriting, almost old-fashioned. He picked it up, feeling the weight of the paper. It was thick, high quality, like something from a different era. He tore it open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Detective Marsh, it reads, "If you want to solve the Parker case, look into the witness statement from January 12th. There's a detail that was overlooked. The Watcher." Henry's brow furrowed. The Parker case was cold, 5 years old, with no new leads in months. He had all but given up on it. How could a stranger know something he didn't? And who was the Watcher? He grabbed the file from the stack on the desk, flipping through it until he found the witness statement mentioned in the letter. It was a brief interview with a neighbor who had heard an argument the night of the murder. Henry had read it a dozen times before, but now, with the letter's suggestion, he noticed something that hadn't been there before, a reference to a shadowy figure seen leaving the scene, which had been dismissed as a trick of the light. "How did I miss this?" he muttered, scribbling a note to follow up. He tossed the letter aside, assuming it was a tip from a concerned citizen, but as he worked late into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something strange about the way the letter had arrived. He checked the building security footage before he left for the night. He watched the recording from outside his office, expecting to see someone drop off the letter. Instead, the hallway remained empty, the camera showing nothing but the flickering lights. His skin prickled with unease. He rewound the footage and watched it again. Nothing. No one had approached the door. He glanced back at the letter on his desk, the name, the Watcher, lingering in his mind. It was just a letter, but it had left him with more questions than answers. As he looked up his office, he decided he would play along. For now, whoever this Watcher was, they had piqued his curiosity. Over the next few weeks, more letters arrived, each one containing a cryptic tip that led Henry to new evidence in old, unsolved cases. There was the robbery at the Chandler jewelry store, the missing child case from the outskirts of town, and the unsolved homicide of a local politician. Every tip was precise, leading him directly to overlooked details that cracked the cases wide open. The tips made him look like a hero, bringing closure to cases that had haunted the precinct for years. His colleagues praised him, but Henry felt a growing unease. The letters arrived without fail, always handwritten on the same high-quality paper, always signed with the same name, the Watcher. One morning, as Henry was reviewing the latest solved case, another letter appeared on his desk. He hadn't seen anyone come in, hadn't heard the door creak open. It was just there, as if it had materialized out of thin air. Detective Marsh had read, "The Johnson murder wasn't random. The victim had evidence on her that tied back to the mayor's office. Look closer. The Watcher." Henry's hand trembled as he read it. The Johnson case was notorious, a brutal stabbing that had rocked the city a decade ago. It had been ruled a random act of violence, but the letter suggested otherwise. He couldn't ignore it. He had to follow the lead. Later that day, he interviewed the coroner who had handled the Johnson case. As they went over old files, the coroner pointed out a small bag of evidence that had been cataloged but never examined. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper with a series of names, city officials, including the mayor at the time. Henry's heart raced. The Watcher was right. This wasn't a random murder. It was a cover-up. He drove back to the precinct, the letter clutched in his hand. He needed to know who was behind these tips. He had solved more cases in the past month than in his entire career, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being used, manipulated by someone with an agenda he didn't understand. He reviewed the security footage again, this time from the day the latest letter had appeared. He watched the timestamp tick by, the camera pointed directly at his door. At precisely 9:15 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared for a split second, barely a blur like a distortion in the footage. It wasn't a person, not entirely. The shade flickered, translucent, before vanishing completely. Henry's blood ran cold. He replayed the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a person, but it wasn't solid, more like an apparition. "The Watcher isn't human," he whispered to himself, a chill settling over him. He leaned back into his chair, staring at the letter. It was impossible, but he couldn't deny what he had seen. Whoever or whatever the watcher was, they weren't just an anonymous tipster. They were something else entirely. Detective Henry Marsh sat in his darkened office, replaying the surveillance footage for what felt like the 100th time. The shadowy, translucent figure that flickered across the screen was like nothing he had ever seen before. He paused the footage, zooming in on the moment it appeared. It wasn't human, that much was clear. It had a faint, ethereal glow, its shape shifting like smoke in a breeze. Henry leaned back, running a hand through his graying hair. He had spent his entire career solving cases with cold, hard evidence. He didn't believe in ghosts, but the footage and the inexplicable appearance of the letters defied all logic. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the stack of letters he had received from the watcher. Each one was written in the same elegant script, the ink slightly smudged as if written in haste. He spread them out on his desk, searching for any clue he might have missed. The tips were incredibly specific, leading him directly to crucial pieces of evidence that had been overlooked for years. It was as if the writer knew the cases intimately, almost better than he did. The latest letter had mentioned the Johnson murder and a connection to the mayor's office. Henry hadn't told anyone about the new evidence he'd uncovered, the crumpled paper with the names of the city officials. If the watcher wasn't human, how could they know? His mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle. He needed answers, and there was only one place to find them: the old archives at the city newspaper. The archives were dusty and dimly lit, the scent of old newsprint filling the air. Henry pulled a box labeled Unsolved Murders and began sifting through the files. He flipped through yellow clippings until he found the article he was looking for: Journalist Missing While Investigating High-Profile Case. The photo showed a young woman with bright eyes and a determined smile. Lillian Hart, Henry read aloud, investigative journalist, disappeared while working on a story about corruption in the mayor's office. His hand shook as he scanned the article. It was dated 10 years ago, the same year as the Johnson murder. The details clicked into place like the final pieces of a puzzle. Lillian Hart had been investigating the very case that had led him here. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The ghostly figure on the footage wasn't just any spirit, it was her, Lillian Hart. She had been the one leaving the letters, guiding him to solve the cases she couldn't in life. Henry leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. He had heard stories of restless spirits, but he had never believed them. Now, he had no choice. Lillian wasn't just trying to solve all cases, she was searching for justice, not just for the victims, but for herself. He gathered the letters and left the archives, the chill of realization settling over him. He had been chasing a ghost, but now he knew her name. Henry sat at his desk, staring at the photo of Lillian Hart clipped from the old newspaper article. Her smile was confident, her eyes sharp with the determination of a seasoned journalist. He couldn't shake the image from his mind, the ghostly figure on the surveillance footage, flickering like a distant memory brought to life. Lillian had died seeking the truth, and now, even in death, she continued her search for justice. He knew what he had to do. If he was going to solve this, he needed to understand why she had reached out to him. He pulled up the old case files on his computer, focusing on the Johnson murder. The pieces fit together too neatly to be a coincidence. Lillian had been investigating corruption in the mayor's office when she disappeared, and the victim in the Johnson case had been carrying evidence connected to the same officials. He felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the truth. Lillian had been killed because of what she knew. The Johnson case wasn't just another unsolved murder. It was the key to uncovering the conspiracy that had cost Lillian her life. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, rustling the papers on his desk. Henry looked up, half expecting to see her standing there. Instead, another envelope lay on top of the case files. The ink, still fresh. Detective Marsh had read. "Be close. He knows you're looking. Be careful. The Watcher." He swallowed hard. Whoever had killed Lillian was still out there, and he knew he was getting closer. He couldn't back down now. He owed it to her to finish what she had started. He left his office and drove to the city's abandoned printing press, where Lillian had been seen the night she disappeared. The building was dark, the windows shattered and covered in grime. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his weight. "Lillian," he called out softly, feeling foolish for speaking into the darkness. "If you're here, show me. Tell me what happened." For a moment, there was only silence. Then a cold hand seemed to brush against his cheek, and the air around him shimmered. He turned and saw her, a translucent figure, standing in the corner, her eyes filled with sorrow. "You were right," he whispered. "They killed you to cover up the truth." Lillian's figure nodded, her expression softening. She pointed to a dark corner of the room, where a bundle of old crumpled papers lay half hidden beneath the rubble. Henry knelt and picked them up, his eyes widening as he realized what he held. It was Lillian's final story, the evidence she had died for. The bundle of papers fell heavy in Henry's hands, like the weight of Lillian's last breath. He unfolded the pages carefully, his flashlight casting a dim circle of light in the dark. The documents were yellowed and frayed, covered in Lillian's hurried scrawl. They detailed her investigation, piecing together a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of city government. It was all there, the evidence that had been buried for a decade. Henry scanned the pages quickly, his pulse racing. Bank records, emails, even photos of secret meetings, all pointing to the same conclusion. The mayor and his associates had orchestrated the murder of the Johnson victim to cover up a bribery scheme, and when Lillian got too close, they silenced her too. A cold breeze swept through the room and he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly and saw her, Lillian Hart, standing there, her translucent form flickering like a candle in the wind. She was watching him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I have it," he whispered. "I have the proof. I can finally bring them down." Lillian nodded, a ghostly tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't fear he saw in her eyes. It was relief. She had been waiting for this moment, guiding him from the shadows, using the only power she had left. Henry stuffed the papers into his coat and hurried out of the building, glancing over his shoulder one last time. Lillian's figure remained in the doorway, her outline fading as she gave him a small, bittersweet smile. He drove straight to the precinct, his mind a blur of thoughts and emotions. He had always prided himself on his skepticism, his refusal to believe in anything he couldn't see or touch. But tonight he had seen a ghost, and he had been touched by her spirit in more ways than one. As he pulled into the parking lot, his phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. "We know what you have. Walk away, Marsh, or you'll end up like her." Henry's blood ran cold. They were watching him. He glanced around, but the lot was empty. He realized then that he had the choice. He could walk away, protect himself, and leave the truth buried, or he could finish what Lillian had started, risking everything to expose the corruption that had costed her life. He gritted his teeth, shoving the phone into his pocket. He already knew his answer. Inside the precinct, he barged into the captain's office, slamming the bundle of papers onto the desk. "You need to see this," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "This is the evidence Lillian Hart had died for. It's time to end this." The captain's eyes widened as he flipped through the documents, realization dawning on his face. This is enough to bring down the mayor," he whispered. "Then do it," Henry snapped. "Make sure her death wasn't in vain." The next few hours were a blur of activity, arrests, press releases, a whirlwind of chaos as the truth was finally dragged into the light. Henry watched it all unfold, feeling a mixture of triumph and sorrow. He had solved the case, but it hadn't brought him the satisfaction he had expected. It felt more like an ending than a victory. Later that night he returned to his office, the moonlight streaming through the window. A single envelope lay on his desk, the last of the watcher's letters. "Thank you, detective," it read. "You gave me the justice I couldn't find in life. Now I can rest. Lillian Hart." Henry's eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat pocket. He walked to the window, looking out at the city he had sworn to protect. It felt different now, as if the weight had been lifted. He closed his eyes, feeling a breeze brush against his cheek, like the soft kiss of a farewell. When he opened them again, the room was empty, the air still. She was gone. Henry sat down at his desk, pulling out his notepad. He began writing, not a case report, but a tribute, a story about a brave journalist who had given her life for the truth and had found a way to ensure justice, even from beyond the grave. It was the least he could do for her, the woman who had been his partner in the shadows, his guide through the mysteries of the past. The city light sparkled outside, and for the first time in years, Henry felt a sense of peace. He had helped the restless spirit find closure, and in doing so, he had found the kind of closure himself. He leaned back, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Rest well, Lillian," he whispered. "You were one hell of a detective."